When I was asked to do a hacking presentation, it sounded like fun. I enjoy probing systems and finding anomalies and then discussing potential threat vectors or doing risk analysis and remediation. But thinking of the intended audience and identifying the many ways someone might exploit you or your devices is probably just going to make you paranoid. In light of that, I think the real value I can offer is in discerning what kinds of threats you should be expecting to face, both today and tomorrow, and explaining how you can protect yourself against those threats. So instead of a hacking presentation, I'm going to do a security presentation with an overview of threats and threat mitigation strategies you can use to improve your security posture. There will be much less emphasis on the how of a particular exploit and more emphasis on the why, or more importantly, the why you. This will be recorded and uploaded for future reference. Feel free to review it again as necessary, as there will be a lot to digest here. I don't have enough time to do a deep dive on any one topic, and I had to omit quite a bit for the sake of keeping it to an hour or less. If you're new to IT security, I'm going to throw a lot at you, and you may not have a lot of time to digest it all. But if there's time afterwards, I can answer more questions. Regardless, having this recorded will mean you can pause and review as necessary, or even Google any of the terms you may not understand. So with that said, let's get started. Strictly defined, a hacker is someone who uses computers or technology to gain unauthorized access to protected resources. That's a pretty broad description, and in my experience, a little misleading. It also doesn't tell you anything about who they are or what their motivations might be. In the early days of computing, a hacker was merely someone who would modify software or hardware to do things it wasn't originally intended to do. But today, hacking is as much about social engineering of people as it is modifying hardware or software. In the end, though, it is still about gaining unauthorized access to a system or acquiring data that you weren't meant to have. In my experience, a hacker can be better described as someone who is smart, curious, tenacious, and refuses to accept the idea that something cannot be done, or more specifically, that something cannot be done to you. They can run the gamut from technology-savvy kids who wish to challenge boundaries to programmers with something to prove, to criminal organizations that hire programmers to do freelance coding work on anonymous projects, often paying in cash or Bitcoin. They also include government security professionals whose motivation is simply to exploit weaknesses in every system they can under the guise of wartime powers or national security. While motivations vary, APTs from the government and NSAs often include their motivations often include spying and espionage, first strike capabilities, establishing persistence in foreign systems, intel gathering on potential adversaries, and battlefield superiority. Their hacking is done with limited oversight and under the banner of Homeland Security, which has become code for you don't need to know, you just need to trust us and not ask too many questions. I'm here to tell you not to trust anyone, especially those who tell you not to trust or ask too many questions. So, what type of hackers do we normally see in a community college environment, and what are their motivations? The original classification of hackers harkens back to the early days of silent Western films, where the characters were clearly defined by the types of hats they wore. Good guys wore white, and bad guys wore black. Since then, the threat landscape has evolved to become a lot more complicated and diverse. In general terms, though, a white hat is an ethical hacker. They may probe a system and gain unauthorized access, but they do not exploit that access. Instead, they warn those in charge that their systems or software has vulnerabilities, and they often go to great lengths to explain those vulnerabilities and help a system administrator close them so they cannot be leveraged by a nefarious person. Their motivation is usually learning how things work and how to improve them, and they tend to be curious and outspoken. Using a car analogy, they would be the type of person who takes an ordinary car and figures out how to mod it into a hot rod. They can be an IT department's best friend and ally, and colleges I have worked for in the past have hired them as student assistants or even security consultants. A black hat is the opposite of a white hat. They look for systems to exploit and then do so for their own personal gain or bragging rights. They do not want vulnerabilities to be fixed or users to know where their weaknesses lie because they make their money or reputations leveraging those weaknesses. Their motivation is exploiting anyone who is less intelligent or technologically savvy than they are. And believe me, they have no shortage of targets. Your goal is to be at least one level above the softest of their targets. Using a car analogy, they would be the thief who smashes your window, hotwires your car, and then drives it to a chop shop to strip and sell anything of value. Gray hats, as the color would imply, are a cross between white hats and black hats. Many members of the hacking collective Anonymous fall into this category. They have a conscience and will usually try to help you, but if you rebuff them or get on the wrong side, they can also be vindictive. A gray hat will frequently tell you when you have a vulnerability, but if you ignore them, dismiss them, or insult their intelligence, they will use that same vulnerability to thoroughly humiliate you. They're mostly seeking recognition, positive reinforcement, and acknowledgement. Using a car analogy, they would be someone who sees an unlocked car and notifies the owner, but then feels criticized for it. The next time they find the car unlocked, they take it for a joyride before crashing it into a ditch. They feel justified in doing so because they believe the owner needed to be taught a lesson. Maybe next time they will listen to them or at least show them some respect. Script kiddies are mostly wannabe hackers with low skill. They know enough to run exploit code that others have developed and maybe even modify it for a specific target, but they are not skilled enough to write their own exploits or cover their tracks like a black hat would. Script kiddie exploits are mostly limited to systems that have not been adequately patched or have been otherwise neglected by a busy system administrator. Their motivation is usually bragging rights and attention seeking as they try to build credibility in the hacking world or amongst their peers on the dark web. Using a car analogy, they would be people walking through a parking lot checking all the car doors with the hope that somebody left their car unlocked and something worth stealing inside. We see a lot of script kiddie activity in the community college systems because they don't know how to cover their tracks very well. These attackers are usually relatively easy to track down when they become a nuisance because in general, if they don't anonymize themselves. Also, more often than not, their attacks tend to be brute force style attacks, which are noisy, meaning they show up in our log files and tend to come from the same set of IP addresses over and over again. They're more of a daily nuisance than anything else, but you also can't ignore them completely. Social engineers are those whose focus is primarily people and not software. It is also the fastest growing form of hacking and provides the best return on investment for criminal enterprises. People are almost always the weakest link in any system, and the more complex the system gets, the easier it is to hack people instead of software. Not coincidentally, this is the primary exploit vector for our colleges today. A social engineer will seek out people in your organization who are eager to please, overly helpful, or otherwise exhibit a characteristic that they can leverage into an exploitable vulnerability. The most common form of social engineering we've been seeing in colleges the past couple months are gift card scams. Someone sends an email from a spoofed address posing as someone from the leadership team who needs you to do them an urgent favor. Because you want to be helpful or look good to your superior, you don't validate their request, you simply do as you've been asked. Using a car analogy, they are the ones who show up when you put your car for sale on Craigslist. They are friendly and engaging and make you feel great. They accept your full asking price, no haggling necessary. They say they trust you, but would like to take the car for a quick spin before giving you the cash. Because they are so friendly, and because you also trust them, you give them your keys, and you never see your car again. Of course, once you realize you've been had, you feel like an idiot, so you don't want to tell anybody about what just happened. And that's exactly why they keep stealing new people's cars. APTs and NSAs, these are the best of the best. They are career professionals that have the best tools and training and nearly unlimited budgets. Their goals differ, but they have access to a virtually unlimited supply of zero-day exploits or other software vulnerabilities that are nearly impossible to defend against. These vulnerabilities are usually not known even to the software manufacturers themselves, which means they remain unpatched. By most estimations, a majority of publicly traded US companies and government institutions have an advanced persistent or APT threat. Most, however, will never know the extent of their problem because an APT shows no obvious symptoms. Think of them as the cold virus of the technology world, but unlike a typical cold virus, they can also mimic your immune system and remain undetected indefinitely. Those infected are largely asymptomatic, but can spread the infection to almost anyone they come in contact with. When the virus finally comes out of dormancy, it is usually to destroy your real immune system and then mortally wound you in some way. They're not interested in doing so unless it is strategically advantageous, though. So in the meantime, they watch, learn, and steal little bits of valuable information here and there. Also, like a virus, there are many different strains that originate in different countries. If you have any degree of notoriety, make a lot of money, have a job that includes access to privileged data, or are prominent in the public eye, you may end up with your own APT. The problem is, you will probably never know about it unless they want you to know, by which point it's too late. Research colleges have been particularly hard hit with APTs and NSAs the past couple of years and have only now begun to grasp the full extent of the problem. After our trade war with China, the rhetoric with North Korea, as well as geopolitical actions taken against Russia and Iran, these APTs have begun to retaliate and steadily escalate their activity against us. I could go into quite a bit of detail on this, but it's probably beyond the scope of this particular presentation and would probably be a presentation all unto itself. So we'll end with APTs there. So that's all great, but I'm in the security business, and if it wasn't a threat, I probably wouldn't have a job. So, in light of that, what kind of independent data sources support this risk analysis? Well, the truth is I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. Any decision you make around your personal campus security should be driven solely by data and nothing more. Anything less, and you truly aren't doing due diligence. We should never make a big decision around assumptions or worse, paranoia. So in the next series of slides, I will include data from sources which we reference on a regular basis, which will hopefully help put the issue in context. None of this data is classified, and it can all be independently searched or validated or otherwise vetted. The average US citizen has had their personally identifiable information stolen an average of 4 times in 2019, source Security Magazine. US data breaches have cost $1.6 trillion in damages and direct losses over the past 10 years, with nearly 11 billion customer records exposed thus far. California leads the nation with 1,493 reported breaches. The average cost to remediate per record breach was $242. Source, Comparatech study in the Digital Guardian. There were 3,800 publicly disclosed data breaches in 2019. Those breaches exposed more than 4 billion records. Source, Norton. F-Secure honeypots picked up 2.9 billion exploit attempts in the first 6 months of 2019. After COVID-19 began to monopolize the news, there were 29,000 phishing attacks per week using the keyword COVID-19. There were 850 million ransomware detections last year, with 621 US public sector organizations disclosing a breach. This includes 49 school districts and 500 individual schools. A new ransomware attack happens every 14 seconds. Source, Kaspersky Labs. Ransomware costs exceeded $75 billion last year worldwide, with the average remediation cost per infection being $133,000. Source, Sophos. 1.5 million new phishing sites are created each month, and more than 280 million malicious websites were identified in 2019. Source, Webroot and Kaspersky Labs. 85% of all emails sent last year contained either a malware dropper, malicious website, or exploit code. Source, Proofpoint. The global average cost of a large-scale data breach across 17 industry sectors was $3.9 million per incident. Source, Ponemon Institute. 86% of breaches were financially motivated. 25 million user accounts from the popular Mathway app were posted for sale on the dark web this past week after a hacker breached their user account database, composed mostly of college students. 4.7 billion fraudulent robocalls are placed every month in the US alone. A Verizon security team analysis of 157,525 identified breaches in 2019 reported that the number one compromised vector were phishing attacks. The second most successful vector were reused credentials stolen from previous data breaches. The third most popular vector was unpatched vulnerabilities and software misconfigurations, and number 4 was social engineering. Business email compromised losses cost US businesses $1.2 billion in 2019. This was mostly from socially engineered and targeted spear phishing of accounts payable personnel with fraudulent invoices or bank routing data. For large-scale attacks, remediation costs in 2019 averaged $8 million, with 7% of breaches costing $10 million or more to remediate. For small-scale attacks, the average cost was closer to $1 million to remediate. The cost to recover the city of Baltimore's information systems after a recent ransomware attack has already exceeded $18 million. One dark web portal, Magbo, is selling a subscription service to more than 43,000 hacked servers and 150,000 hacked websites, a large portion of which are college portals. Online college textbooks from more than one company contained malware payloads last year. Silent Librarian, also known as Cobalt Dickens, is a nation-state-sponsored hacking effort on behalf of Iran that is targeting colleges and universities in protest of trade and information sharing sanctions on their country. They have already compromised 380 universities. Their methodology is a combination of credential stealing attacks, spoofed campus login pages, and malware droppers. Their goal is to gain access to research data and establish a persistent foothold in trusted campuses that would allow them to pivot to other colleges and universities, as well as US government and corporate networks via those colleges' trusted IP address ranges. Claims against cyber insurance have become so high that many insurers are now refusing to pay or challenging insurance claims in court, saying that cyber warfare is to blame and therefore they are exempt from paying out on their policies under wartime provision clauses. The truth is, we know more breaches are happening than are currently being reported. A loose patchwork of reporting requirements are hiding the true extent of the problem. Many companies refuse to report because of the bad publicity that will ensue, or conflicting opinions about what actually constitutes a breach. There's also a lack of knowledge about what regulations apply to them, and few, if any, penalties for refusing to disclose a breach. That became painfully apparent after GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulations, went into effect in the EU. The law included a potential penalty applied for data breaches that can be traced back to a source, and after it was enacted, the EU went from almost no reported breaches and the general perception that most systems were secure to more than 59,000 reported breaches in the first 8 months after the law went into effect. The US would likely see a similar dramatic rise in reported breaches if we had similar legislation around responsible disclosure of breaches. So, how hard do you think it would be to hack the NSA, or the CIA, or the DoD, or each of the branches of the military? How about our nuclear facilities or our critical infrastructure like our electrical grid? These organizations have access to the best available defenses, the most training, and some of the brightest technology staff and security teams in the world. Security is a core part of their operations, and they can do nearly anything they want under the guise of security, which you and I and the institutions we work for will never be able to do. With all of that at their disposal, each of these organizations has been breached in the past 2 years. The size of their security budgets and access to their latest and greatest security technology notwithstanding, the bottom line is that they still have the very same vulnerabilities that you and I and our colleges do. No matter how they architect their environments or how many precautions they take, they're still only as good as their weakest link. And the weakest link is almost always someone who did something without thinking or asking first. If you're curious about the state of cybersecurity or want additional vetted sources of research data, I highly recommend the annual Verizon Breach Reports. They are free and break down threat behavior by motivation, target, methodology, and attack vector, and summaries are further broken down by threat analysis in each sector, as well as year-over-year trends. Finally, as I was writing this presentation, I had to take time to patch some of our own systems as the Microsoft June patch update just dropped and contains fixes for 129 reported vulnerabilities, including 11 critical remote code execution vulnerabilities. That brings the patches for Microsoft products alone, which is only a small part of our networks and our local campus environments, to more than 616 in the first 6 months of this year, including fixes for some of our favorite pen testing exploit vectors, SMB vulnerabilities. So, what hacker would actually care about a small rural college or the community college system? And what have you actually seen or dealt with at work? In my first week after being hired by Butte on behalf of the Chancellor's office, I discovered our system-wide resources were being leveraged more heavily by bad actors than they were by our intended audience. Unbeknownst to management or our IT staff, we were running an anonymous FTP server hosting porn and wares, and we had an SQL injection vulnerability that a hacker had already exploited to gain full control over one of the databases of a critical statewide initiative. Within the first month of deploying a rudimentary WAF in front of our services, we were capturing and sinkholing more than 40,000 viruses and malware-laden vectors each month. After securing our systems and implementing best practice security in our environments, I was asked to begin auditing some of our grant partners and software development contract holders. Little, if any, of those systems were compliant with ISO standards around security, and they did not become fully compliant until those conditions were explicitly written into their contracts and routine audits were performed to ensure they maintained compliance. I am happy to say that the security of our systems has been improving in leaps and bounds over the past 15 years, but community colleges in general are still woefully understaffed when it comes to technology support, and our system administrator to end user ratio is only getting worse. On top of that, they are being asked to support technology stacks and authentication systems that are more complex and evolving more rapidly than at any time in history. In light of this, the California community colleges have done a remarkable job in only having a handful of notable breaches, most of which were due to end user oversight. But the truth is, our adversaries have more time and more resources than we do, and it's only a matter of time before they find something that we do not know how to defend against. As a system administrator, you have to protect everything all the time, or you fail. As a hacker, you only need to get lucky once to win. Since you're only as secure as your weakest link, security must be everyone's job. IT may block 1,000 malicious email attachments a day at the border, but they will never catch every single one. It's simply impossible. That means end users have to be an integral part of the security equation, and they have to do their part by thinking before clicking on the one that does get through. Most modern malware, credential stealers, and redirects are impossible to distinguish from legitimate activity by the average user, and actually by most IT staff as well, for that matter. I've never actually worked in the end user support role at Butte, so I'm not privy to what their policy is on admin access for faculty or staff computers, but generally speaking, admin access for faculty or staff is a bad idea. I can't tell you how many network VLANs we had to clean up at a college I used to work for, all because one faculty member insisted on doing research on various porn sites with his work computer. This was compounded by him having full admin access to install software on that machine, which meant the malware he picked up also had full admin access. Removing Trojans and malware from his computer and everything it came into contact with was a daily or weekly ritual that continued for months under the guise of academic freedom. Today, that same system might also touch campus administrative computing systems, statewide authentication systems, and portals from partners and affiliates around the country. Also, today's malware, Trojans, and ransomware are even harder to detect and have developed polymorphic capabilities and VM or sandbox detection and escape capabilities. Modern systems are also highly dependent on SMB, Radius, Shibboleth, and various other authentication and single sign-on implementations, which means the blast radius of a breach system is much harder to contain. For what it's worth, these are some of the same technologies we tend to exploit when a college has asked us to do a security audit of their campus. There's almost always an unpatched SMB vulnerability somewhere in the land that can be leveraged to elevate permissions and cross security boundaries until we can eventually dump the entire forest for subsequent brute forcing. Our job is to teach colleges where they are vulnerable and how to protect themselves from these types of threats. But truth be told, the single greatest threat to your campus still comes from your end users. As I said earlier, it's easier to convince someone in payroll that your direct deposit account has changed than it is to actually hack the college's payroll system. Finally, in the good old days of a couple of years ago, when a new security vulnerability was announced, it would take somewhere between weeks to a few months before hackers began to successfully exploit it. With reverse engineering of patches becoming increasingly automated, now those same attacks are coming hours to days after a patch has been released. Your college IT team is walking a dangerous tightrope of who can patch faster than the hacker can exploit an unpatched system. Unfortunately, patches need to be tested first, which takes time and puts us at a disadvantage. Tools like Showdown can essentially report on 100,000 internet addresses that contain a potential vulnerability in a matter of seconds. Just like Google indexes the contents and keywords of the internet, tools like Showdown index the open ports, protocols, and responses of every device in an IP range of interest. Not very long ago, it would have taken a good programmer weeks to work to discover a new vulnerability. After that, they would have had to manually carry out an exploit attempt on each vulnerable system by hand. Now that same attack can be carried out against 1,000 servers at a time using a combination of artificial intelligence, machine learning, port indexing services, reverse engineered patches, and automated attacks sent by a botnet army. These attackers don't know and don't care that you're a small rural college. Their army of attack bots is systematically going through a list of potentially vulnerable IP addresses. So, how many colleges have actually been breached this year? This is hard to quantify. Many states don't have clearly defined reporting requirements around security breaches, and certainly nobody wants to willingly admit that they were compromised. Nobody wants that kind of bad publicity. The Department of Education is starting to mandate the reporting of breaches that are reasonably believed to affect student records, and penalties for not doing so can be significant. Most of what we do know is simply because it was impossible to hide, particularly in the case of ransomware, where the college's critical infrastructure was encrypted and rendered unusable. Either they paid the ransom or restored their systems from known good backups. What I can speculate is that most of these colleges probably thought they had done due diligence with their security practices and might have even assumed they were better than average, at least until they discovered they were in fact the low-hanging fruit. In many of these cases, it was a careless action by one employee that put the entire institution in this unenviable position. It was that unexpected email with the catchy headline and the link that seemed too good to be true, or that login screen that looked like the campus domain but wasn't, or that urgent request that prompted them to act without thinking, or the password reset that they thought came from IT and which they complied with, even though IT said that they would never actually ask for such a thing. In addition to the embarrassment and bad press, these colleges also spend a considerable amount of their budgets to re-secure their systems, perform forensic analysis, and comply with data breach notification requirements. In case you're curious about what we are seeing in community college environments, here are the most prominent and frequently successful attack vectors. Number one would have to be social engineering attempts, followed by unintentional PII disclosure, accounts payable scams, staff and student identity theft attempts, payment or asset redirection, data exfiltration attempts, BYOD infected with malware, malware and ransomware attacks, denial of service attacks, and the aforementioned script kiddies who never seem to sleep or go away. In the past couple months, we've also seen a persistent gift card scams and your account has expired or follow this link to log in credential stealing attacks. A more recent and probably more disturbing trend has been malware-laden USB devices left laying around campus with the hope that faculty or staff will pick one up and plug it into their computer. This, of course, is always worse if you're running with admin access on your device. Here are some notable recent breaches which have likely exposed your data already and increased your risk of being phished, socially engineered, or hacked. When I originally composed this list, it was specifically targeted to Butte employees for the presentation to Butte, but in reality, pretty much everybody on this, every one of these companies on this list also affects other people in the CCC system. You read the following stats, think about the data these organizations have collected on you. Almost all of your major purchases are financial transactions, your medical records and history, your phone call records, your texts and photos. Now think about how that data can be weaponized against you because it's being aggregated with data from other dumps, including social media, to build a profile on you. This may be used to impersonate you or convince someone else that they are you, and they need help resetting your password or updating your permissions. Probably your single biggest risk factor, which you do have control over, is with password reuse. Most people only have a few passwords that they reuse over and over again for different logins. Even if their passwords are slightly different on every site, it usually follows a pattern which makes it rememberable. When a hacker gets hold of your password in one of these data dumps, the first thing they usually do is perform an automated password spray attack against every site they suspect you may have an account on. In many cases, that reused password gets them into something else, and then they're off to the races. If you have been reusing passwords or following any sort of discernible pattern for your passwords, you will likely be owned with this method pretty quickly. For those using a password variation routine, the aggregated passwords stolen from multiple sources can be compared to reverse engineer the pattern. And once that pattern is known, it can be leveraged against other more valuable targets, like your bank or retirement accounts. If you remember only one thing from this presentation, it should be this: do not ever reuse a password. Not under any circumstances, not once, not ever. When multiple data dumps are combined together, especially when they contain data from social media profiles, there is pretty decent probability of hackers being able to guess things like the answers to your security questions. People reveal a lot more about themselves and their families than they realize, as a quick Google search, keyword search on yourself will soon tell you. Google dorking is particularly valuable when you are socially engineering a target, and you should do the same to yourself if you want to know what a potentially nefarious person already knows about you. Other things hackers will use this data for is to impersonate you while committing financial and medical fraud. If you have a median or better income, a good credit history, or decent health benefits, you should consider yourself a high-value target for fraud and identity theft. Monitor your credit reports or put a freeze on your accounts. Odds are you already have credit report monitoring from the likes of AAA or Experian or someone else that has been contracted on your behalf as a result of a recent data breach. Also, you're entitled to one copy of your credit report from each of the big 3 reporting agencies each year. If you stagger those pulls to get a different one every 4 months, you can keep a revolving pull of your reports for free indefinitely. There's a massive amount of your data already circulating in the dark web, which makes highly targeted spear phishing much easier. I've seen a major uptick in this after the recent LinkedIn breach. Do not overshare on social media. Keep personal details private, especially if you will be traveling or will be out of town for more than a day. Do not share your trip photos until you are home again and able to receive notifications for things like account transactions. People that have been spearphished or otherwise targeted will often wait until they know you will not be able to intervene to stop them. You might find that trip to Africa, which you've been planning and talking about for months, suddenly got a lot more expensive when they cleaned out your bank account while you were on Safari and couldn't respond to the emails. Even if everything in your environment has been patched and you're practicing perfect security hygiene, your data isn't circulating in the dark web, and you have become a virtually invisible ghost to the rest of the world, you still aren't in the clear. You can only ever be as secure as your weakest link, and the weakest link is almost always a helpful person with access to your information. We love helpful people. They make our lives easier. Hackers love them even more for the same reason. They make exploits almost trivial to carry out. In the clip I'm about to play, the hack we are seeing doesn't involve reverse engineering software or outsmarting your system administrator. If you are a teacher, this is something that any one of your students could probably do to you today with the proper motivation. Your risk grows inversely proportionate to your net worth, popularity, outspokenness, or other measure of notoriety or success.
So I invited a few of the world's best hackers to try to hack me and show me where my vulnerabilities are. And now I'm going to meet them in Las Vegas for DEF CON, the biggest hacker convention of the year. They're going to hack me using social engineering, which is essentially hacking without any code. They just use a phone and an internet connection.
Do you want to do a sample phishing call?
What's phishing?
Phishing is voice solicitation, and basically what you do is you use the phone to extract information or data points that can be used in a later attack.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Who are you gonna call?
Maybe I'll call your cell phone provider
Okay.
and see if I can get them to give me your email address.
I bet they're good. I bet they have my back. But yeah, go for it.
I'm going to spoof from your number, so it's going to look like it's calling from you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me okay? My baby, I'm sorry. my husband's like, we're about to apply for a loan and we just had a baby and he's like, get this done by today. So I'm so sorry. I can't call you back. I'm trying to log into our account for uses information and I can't remember what email address we used to log the account. The baby's crying and can you help me? Awesome.
In just 30 seconds,
At gmail.com.
Jessica gets access to my personal email address.
Now, if I needed to add our older daughter on our account so she could call in and make changes, how would I need to go about doing that? You would have to send me a secure PIN through a text message? Yeah, well, the thing is, I don't think I'll be able to receive a text message if I'm on the phone. Shh. Oh, I'm not on there either? So I thought when we got married, he added me to the account.
Jess uses my girlfriend's name and a fake social security number
5127.
to set up her own personal access to my account.
Wait, I'm sorry, so there's no password on my account right now? Can I set that up?
She even gets the support person to change my password.
Thank you so much for your help today.
So she just basically blocked me out of my own account.
I'll get her fed after this. All right, thank you.
Holy shit. So they just gave you access to my entire cell phone account.
You're gonna have to go on and change your password now because it's Jess, my name.
And all it took was a crying baby and a phone call.
Yes.
So, how are you going to defend against something like that? Bottom line is you can't, and that's the point. There's always a vulnerability somewhere. Security isn't black or white, and it never will be. It's always shades of gray. It's also rarely under our exclusive control. But you do need to control what you can, and your primary job around security is to minimize your exposure to risk, to yourself and your institution, by following security best practices and keeping an eye out for vulnerable processes and exploitable weaknesses. At the beginning, I said I was not going to teach you how to hack, but I still want you to think like a hacker. Why are you being targeted? What are your weaknesses and what vectors might be effective against you? Now close those security gaps and think about the next most likely potential vulnerabilities. Apply appropriate countermeasures. Rinse and repeat until you're no longer the lowest hanging fruit in your organization or your peer group. So, what can you actually do to protect yourself and your institution? You've probably heard about using unique, complex passwords that do not follow any discernible pattern. These passwords should be, at the minimum, 8 characters long, although longer is better. They should contain a combination of upper and lowercase characters, as well as numbers and special characters. The idea being, the more complexity your password contains, the harder it will be to brute force using rainbow tables, dictionary attacks, or a hash cracker. Your password doesn't have to be unbreakable. It just needs to be difficult enough for an attacker to decide it isn't worth their effort anymore, and they move on to the next user's password. Of course, complex passwords are nearly impossible to remember without a password manager. I personally use and highly recommend LastPass, which is available in both free and paid versions. There are a few others that are also good, but any password manager needs to support strong encryption and it needs to be unbreakable from the standpoint of brute force attacks. Also, the company that makes your password manager should never be able to recover a password for you under any circumstances. This means that if they are breached or compelled to disclose a decryption key by any government, foreign or domestic, neither the attacker nor the government can recover your passwords either. Because of this, your LastPass password should be something you can remember and should be protected by a second factor of authentication. You cannot afford to lose this one. I currently administer more than 500 unique sites and do not know the password for a single one of them. They are all complex, unique, and managed by my password manager. And though this could be viewed as a single point of failure, LastPass does allow you to cache your credentials locally, encrypted at rest, as well as print a password list so you can keep a hard copy somewhere secure, like a safety deposit box in the event of a catastrophic technology failure. Finally, LastPass works on both your desktop computers and mobile devices, regardless of the manufacturer, and it integrates natively with two-factor authentication options from a variety of providers. It also works with all the major web browsers via a native plugin that calls the app whenever it finds a login form. This makes password management seamless, secure, always available, and safely encrypted, regardless of your platform of choice. Another thing you can do is use two-factor authentication on all critical accounts. In fact, you should be using it whenever reasonably possible. For those who are not familiar with two-factor authentication, this is a means of providing a second method of proving you are who you say you are. The most basic form of authentication is a password, sometimes combined with a location like an IP address. A second form of authentication is something that presumably only you have access to, like your phone or a digital key fob that a hacker should never be in possession of. Usually they also contain something like facial recognition or a thumbprint recognition or some other device too that would be really hard to spoof. 2FA, or two-factor authentication, dramatically improves your security and should not be cumbersome when properly implemented. With the prevalence of stolen passwords and password reuse, many sites now require you to enter a code sent to one of your devices as a second authentication factor. Colleges need to be doing the same wherever possible. Do not log into your work or personal accounts from a public Wi-Fi hotspot or any access point you do not own and actively manage unless you're connected to a VPN tunnel. Man-in-the-middle attacks are a real risk via publicly available access points, and spyware or malware on public hotspots can sniff your traffic or impersonate you or the device you are talking to in an effort to redirect you or steal your login credentials or sensitive information or take authentication tokens for your session. If you're involved in research and are traveling to China or Russia for work, or you need to raise the bar even higher and carry a burner phone or a burner laptop. These should be fully patched and imaged with only the bare minimum software needed to do your job while overseas. When you get home, copy your documents off to a secure location and then re-image the burner device. Do not connect a burner device to your local network when you get home, and change any passwords you used while abroad. Do not click links in emails or texts which you are not expecting, or which come from people you do not know. Modern cross-site scripting exploits can redirect you to a malicious attack website before acting as a proxy to relay you back to the proper destination, all without your knowledge or any visual indications. This happens near instantaneously, and it's nearly impossible to detect. While you are working away at your legitimate destination, the attack website is probing your computer's defenses, looking for vulnerabilities to exploit, or collecting keystrokes or some other nefarious activity. Do not respond to urgent messages asking you to do something unusual or claiming to be from a member of the management team or anyone with a supervisory role over you, which comes from a private email address or from an unusual time or location. Look at email addresses for a variation of your domain name that is either misspelled or embedded in another domain, or which does not originate from within your parent domain. Do not ever give a password to any person claiming to be from IT or technical support. We can assume your account permissions, if necessary, through privilege escalation. It is up to us to prove our identity to you, not the other way around. Install software updates regularly on your personal devices. Unpatched vulnerabilities in Windows and Mac operating systems and applications from the Adobe suite are frequently the top attack vectors we see, with rogue apps in the Android store and flawed or unpatched Java-based apps being close behind. Also, while on the subject, you should make sure that you only download apps from the official app stores, because there are an awful lot of Trojan apps, particularly for Android platform. Disable and remove Adobe Flash and Internet Explorer if installed from your computers. Those two products are disproportionate vectors for malware and system compromise attempts and are so riddled with security vulnerabilities that they are effectively impossible to secure. Google Chrome is a good alternative to Internet Explorer, especially when set to auto-update. Your IT department should have automatic security updates scheduled for all your work devices, but you need to be installing them on your phones and other personal electronic devices yourself. If your device is too old to receive updates, stop using it and replace it because it's only a matter of time before it will be breached. Be an advocate for encryption. Strong encryption is the only way a modern society can function in the electronic age without descending into complete chaos. It is at the foundation of good security. Understand it and use it as if it were the one technology you cannot live without, because it is. Those who would like to take your security away will obfuscate the encryption argument by saying only bad people use encryption and nobody needs strong or unbreakable encryption unless they are doing something shady. Those are straw man arguments. We all need strong encryption. It is simply the only thing that cannot be easily hacked, at least until quantum computing becomes mainstream. Social media should be used with the assumption that everything posted is done so with no effective security settings. That means if you don't intend to make something public, it should not be posted at all, regardless of the security settings you have chosen. In fact, it is the fact is you share more information than you realize simply by having a social media account. This includes information like who your friends are, how often you communicate with them, and what you say. And I mean that literally, as in every meaningful keyword of your private conversations is being indexed. You also share your web browsing history and TV watching activity unwittingly through data sharing agreements with your ISP. While you consciously share your likes and dislikes on social media, you probably don't know that you are unconsciously also sharing your location data, photos, the contents of your post, and instant messages, what motivates you psychologically, and so much more while using these apps. This is not by accident or oversight, it is by design, and they are not even trying to hide it. The details are all there, shrouded in legalese and buried in the privacy agreements that you didn't read when you clicked OK. When a product is free, it is because the primary value of that product is derived from you. You are the thing that is being sold. If we have time at the end of this presentation, I will go into greater detail about user tracking across platforms, the tracking code and cookies in nearly all websites and social media platforms, undeletable super cookies, and the data sharing agreements that Facebook, Instagram, and even your local department store have with your credit card companies and financial institutions. Your internet service providers and cell phone companies are also aggregating and sharing or selling information about your preferences and behaviors, and all of this is being combined to determine your virtual world view, including what news you will see, what ads are targeted to you, and even which friends you will be encouraged to interact with. Limiting your data sharing is nearly impossible, particularly on mobile versions of their apps, and for the most part, these data aggregators probably know more about you than you likely know about yourself, at least consciously. In fact, their prediction algorithms have gotten so good that in some cases, they're able to predict if a woman is pregnant before she even knows herself, merely by the things she buys, the things she watches, her emotional responses to the things in her news feed, and even how long she lingers in a particular aisle at her local Target store. These are all combined with subtle changes in her psychological profile to paint a picture that is much more complete than our conscious minds realize. It is also a uniquely effective way of getting people to do things they might not ordinarily do, including voting a particular way with just the right combination of targeted advertisements to provide the final push needed by our own unique individual psychologies. Do not use USB charging ports in airports, cafes, or public places. Bring your own wall charger instead, as many public chargers are known to be infected with malware that can compromise your device and exfiltrate data or passwords. LAX is notorious for having compromised or Trojanized USB charging ports. They replaced most of them after they discovered the problem, only to have them hijacked again to spread new malware to unsuspecting travelers. Do not stay logged into a local admin account unless you're installing software. Use a limited account for daily computer activity, only escalating your privileges for a legitimate reason, like installing security patches. If you aren't running with elevated permissions, chances are the drive-by downloads that you unintentionally pick up won't be able to install under your user profile without you knowing about it. Drive-by downloads would be another good thing to cover along with cross-site scripting because they're incredibly prevalent and nearly impossible to detect. Be wary of clickbait sites. Clickbait is basically luring people to a site for the ad revenue generated by page hits. Some clickbait sites also contain malware or malicious redirects, but their primary driver is usually ad revenue. Clickbait sites frequently pose as news sites or claim to have content frequently stolen, repurposed, or computer generated about a current event or a social or political hot button issue. Google takes down between 2 and 4 billion fraudulent clickbait websites and nearly 1 million phishing websites every year. Periodically check the HIBP website for your email address. The Have I Been Owned website is a summary of more than 450 websites with more than 9 billion user accounts that are known to have been stolen and are currently being traded on the dark web. If your email address shows up there, that means at least one of those accounts has been breached and the password for that account is being sold or traded on the dark web. That password and variations of the same are regularly being tested against your bank accounts, social media accounts, healthcare accounts, email accounts, and anywhere else which may contain valuable information. As the aggregated data on you grows through additional breaches, and when leveraged with social media content, nefarious actors find it easier to guess things like your security questions. Right now, most of our colleges are logging somewhere between 75,000 and 90,000 suspicious activities each day. A suspicious activity is not necessarily a hacking attempt. It could be as simple as someone reset their password and forgot it and tried multiple different combinations until they were either given an automatic timeout after too many failed attempts or otherwise gave up. But a lot of the traffic showing up in these logs are malware, malicious redirects, or phishing and spoofing attempts and email messages that were blocked at the gateway. Port scans, SQL injection attempts, and script keys or botnet activity forms the bulk of the rest. What is clear, though, is that the amount of malicious traffic hitting college firewalls and WAFs is growing, which means the problem is only getting worse. The internet, once a bastion of innovation and the free exchange of ideas, is now also the playground of cybercrime syndicates and advanced persistent threats. It is simply beyond the capabilities of system administrators to defend against this onslaught all by themselves. No person can keep up with a botnet army or a distributed denial of service attack. It's simply too much data coming at you too fast, and decisions or countermeasures around an attack need to occur in real time. The future of defense in depth will be machine learning automated with human oversight. Deep packet inspection and continuous analysis of incoming data will see patterns emerge that humans might miss and which algorithms will be able to respond to faster than a person can. Computers will continue to efficiently multitask without being called off a critical incident response to reset somebody's password or some other menial task, and they will never take a lunch break or need sleep. The security teams of the future will be the ones that understand machine learning and artificial intelligence and can leverage these tools along with the log files of their servers and workstations in defense of their organizations. We will never eliminate the hacker threat completely. We need to accept that. The threat will also continue to evolve in unexpected ways and will continue using new technologies we may not be familiar with. The best we can hope to do is to make their job a little harder than the next easiest target on their list. Hackers are people, and while they may control vast botnet armies running sophisticated code, they are still ultimately controlled by people. People, generally speaking, are lazy. Hackers are no exception. If they meet sufficient resistance, they will move on to the next easiest target. Our job and your job is to be a little better than the next easiest target. We can't hire our way out of the security problems of the future. It is cost prohibitive and the manpower simply doesn't exist today, and there's a good chance it may never exist. Throwing money at the security problem is not the only solution. though underfunding it also involves other risks. Our colleges are facing major budget shortfalls, and security is an attractive place to make cuts. It is something that seems good enough right up until the moment you realize it's not. Administration at our institutions need to justify if a few $1,000s here can reasonably offset the risk of a compromise which will cost tens of thousands to $1 million or more to remediate. It's an unenviable position to be in, and something that's well beyond my pay grade to assume authority over. One thing we can do on the cheap, though, is enforce best practices and educate end users about the emerging risks and attack vectors we are facing. Your defensive computing practices and knowledge of our threat risks will go a long way to bolstering our defenses, and is the cheapest and most effective countermeasure we have. The nation state and APT threat will continue to grow, especially as political rhetoric continues to grow and an increasing percentage of government actions are taking place through back-channel covert operations that most US citizens will never have the clearances to know about. While it is unlikely that another country will formally declare a war with the United States, we are absolutely engaged in an unofficial cyber war. I cannot talk about specifics of any of the actions that may or may not be taking place, but I can say that these other countries did not start the current conflict. They are largely responding to actions we initiated against them, most notably through NSA and CIA hacking of their critical infrastructure. This includes planting of malware and Trojan horses in their networks, hijacking of their routing tables to force their communications through gateways we had already decrypted and gained control over, and even the outright destruction of their equipment through strategic cyber bombing runs designed to look like catastrophic IT accidents. In this cyber war and the cyber wars of the future, civilians are considered fair targets and are in fact the primary targets. Colleges are an especially attractive target as they tend to have large IP address ranges that are reserved and well-established trust relationships with public and private sector targets. The bottom line is, if we haven't already been compromised, it's a near certainty that it will happen eventually. And that is why strong encryption will eventually become our most important asset of the future. When the eventual does happen, the sensitive data of our students, faculty, staff, accounts payable, and business office activities, as well as our grants and partnerships and a host of other valuable information will be exfiltrated. If that data is properly encrypted in transit and at rest, the data becomes nearly worthless once it leaves an institution. And now I'm going to go on a rant. Anyone who tells you encryption is bad or is only used by those hiding illegal activities is being disingenuous. Anyone who tells you the government can safely have backdoors into encryption and prevent bad guys from doing the same is flat out lying. Anyone who advocates for a modern clipper chip is not acting in your best interest. Anyone who tells you that law enforcement can't do their job without breaking encryption because of the risk of going dark either doesn't understand the technology in use today or is intentionally misleading you. There is no valid debate to the contrary. Naysayers can only point to the paranoid ramblings of law enforcement officials who are afraid of losing access to the environments they have already compromised, many in violation of the Fourth Amendment. They are willing to accept the world we are currently living in. I should say they are unwilling to accept the world we are currently living in or the technologies we are currently using, and they want a return of the good old days when wiretaps were done with a wink and a nod. Well-implemented, strong encryption is the only hope we have for the future of our networks and the internet as a tool or a resource. Without it, we are engaged in a race to the bottom, and nothing will be able to save us from the worst aspects of humanity. That's the end of my rant, and probably the end of this presentation, as it looks like I'm about out of time. Whomever is posting this presentation for you today should be able to validate or provide you with a URL that you can also download it. Should you want to review any of this later. I know I threw a lot at you and did it fairly quickly without a lot of explanation. So you're going to have to probably look at some of the terms you're not familiar with via some Google searches and maybe do your own due diligence on what's been said here. It was a pleasure speaking with you today, and I hope you were able to glean at least something useful. Thanks.